Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good to have y'all back. Thanks for joining us for our month 5 workshop here. We'll go over considerations for funding options and data system updates. Give everybody a few seconds to trickle in and then we'll get started. All right. Great. Well, thank you for joining. So we'll get started here, cover over our agenda for today. We will begin by discussing the preliminary covered buildings list, have some updates for you, as well as some bill updates. And then we'll hop into considerations and funding options for data system updates, then discuss our upcoming workshop schedule, which is just one left, and then head into Q&A. So for the preliminary covered buildings list, we have a couple updates for you today. Still working on culling this list. That's an ongoing process that will continue. But for now, we do have an updated version that will be released with this month's workshop's resources. So when we release the resources for this workshop, the CEO website will have also replaced the covered buildings list that's there now with the newest updated version. A couple things we did for this new version were find some addresses that were missing from our initial list in some places where that wasn't data we were given initially during our outreach. And the other thing is we removed a couple buildings, around 70 or so buildings that we deemed not easily converted into another use type. These buildings are things like agricultural, industrial, manufacturing type buildings that seemed appropriate to remain in that type of use, as opposed to being able to easily transition into another type of use, even with an ownership change. So these are ones that have been removed. Any of the ones remaining will continue to be addressed and looked into, but for now, those were the ones that we've been able to take off. So hopefully some good stuff will be seen from this list, or some helpful changes here with this new inclusion of addresses, as well as the removal of some of these other buildings that we felt probably shouldn't be subject. And that's the news on the covered buildings list. When it comes to the bill, have some updates for you in terms of what's been going on. Bill was officially presented to the House on April 21st, and so far it's passed through 2 committee hearings. And it goes into its next committee hearing on Friday, where there will be a vote as well as there were in the past 2 committee reviews, and then continue on to another committee after that. So I'll keep you posted as things develop, but for now it's moving along. Hopefully we'll have some more information, maybe even a final vote by our final June 16th workshop. Along with the journey, there's also been some changes. So amendments have been presented for this bill as it's been going through these committee hearings. A couple of the amendments here I wanted to bring up as they relate to utilities. The first one, and I'm sure this one's going to be very welcomed, is that the deadline to implement these requirements outlined for qualified utilities in the bill has been pushed from January 1st to June 1st, 2022. So that gives a whole another 6 months in order to address some of these updates and implement some additional systems or processes, policies, whatever it needs to take for you guys. So that's great news there. Glad we got that one in. The additional update is that it refers to the data requirement. So once an owner requests data from the utility, the initial bill stipulated a 30-day timeline to get that data delivered to the customer. Now there's been an update to the bill that allows for this first year, any requests for data from a covered building contact that's received in 2022 will have 90 days to get that data to the customer. Utilities will have 90 days as opposed to 30. However, when it gets to 2023, any requests that come in for data in 2023 or later will then be a 30-day delivery requirement for utilities. And this is great news too. Definitely gives you a bit of time to play around with things, make sure you have enough time to get things pulled together. But ultimately, 30 days should be enough once you guys get in the flow. on top of that too, when you go any farther than 30 days, you risk the customer getting involved and getting all riled up, and that's something all of us would appreciate avoiding. So good stuff there coming out of some updates from amendments on the bill, and just wanted to let you guys know how that's been transforming. So additional updates here relating to the definition for qualifying utility. It now includes the type of utility in the definition. So not a big update, but just a small change to the language there in the bill that just specifies, this applies to any type of utility with 5,000 or more active commercial industrial accounts or customers in the state. In addition to that, because of the First Amendment I shared with y'all, on or before June 1st is now that deadline to fulfill requirements for qualifying utilities. Just a reminder what those are is establishing an aggregation threshold that is 4 or fewer, publishing that threshold on your public website, and then upon the request of utility energy data, you just provide that energy usage to the owner who requests it within now 90 days for this first year of 2022. Additional updates in terms of the actual data that we need to provide on a qualifying utility basis. So if you're a qualifying utility, the data you provide must be available through the easily navigable web portal using some sort of online request form ideally in order to expedite that. And that online request form has to have up-to-date standards for digital authentication, like a one-time single-use password, multi-factor authentication type standards. Provide the owner that data within 90 days after their valid request for 2022, and then within 30 days from 2023 on. And that data must be directly uploaded into the owner's benchmarking tool and or delivered in a spreadsheet template that is provided by the benchmarking tool. The one we've provided on the CEO website and discussed in past workshops suffices for a portfolio manager. If someone was using an additional outside tool, you'd have to update and go with that spreadsheet to fulfill the requirement. But ultimately, that Energy Star portfolio manager one's going to be the most common and fit the bill in almost every case. And finally, provided to the owner on at least an annual basis. So after that request has been made, you'll have to give them their full year's worth of data, and this can happen on a monthly basis and or once a year until the owner revokes that request or sells their covered building and the new owner requests it from you. In addition, the energy data provided by qualifying utilities must also be provided regardless of whether or not the owner is named on the utility account. It's not your responsibility to determine ownership. So essentially, when the owner requests, they're legally telling you that they are the responsible party. They should be receiving this information. So that onus is on them. It's not on you to confirm or qualify. So that's a good clarification and a lot less off your back there when it comes to ownership needs. In addition, if there are multiple tenants at the building that would require consent, then you will need to be able to manage consent forms, privacy forms, whether you're a qualifying utility or not. So in either case, aggregation is going to be necessary for those multiple tenant clients. And you will need to provide some way in which they can have their tenants give consent in order for their data to be included in that aggregation. So now that we've gone through the basics, some general updates of the bill, I just wanted to run through a quick refresher too on what the benchmarking process is for owners before we jump into what you're needing to provide again, and specifically on system update side and how maybe we'll fund those things. So essentially, as a reminder, for the benchmarking for owners, the benchmarking process would require them to submit their whole building energy use through their online benchmarking tool on an annual basis. So essentially, this has two levels. One is a building owner who just has one building. It's them as the tenant and or just one other tenant. The other side of things is a multifamily structure or a multi-tenant commercial building where there's additional tenants, additional meters, accounts that need to be aggregated together. So there's two separate scales here, but essentially in either case, you'll need to be able to provide the data required. So it will have to be whole building energy use. And this needs to be submitted annually by the owner, So again, goes back to your ability to deliver this to a customer on an annual basis and or monthly basis, depending on your route. So like I said, even if you're not a qualifying utility, you'll still need to find a way to deliver this information into the hands of your customers. And really, it's fairly simple and straightforward when it comes to a single tenant or a single owner situation. The aggregation piece comes into play only with the multifamily and or multi-tenant commercial spaces. So really the big haul falls on that aggregation side, and I'd say that's the priority for focusing on when you're trying to determine policies, develop best practices, and decide on the route you're going to take in terms of delivering data to customers upon request. Some considerations given all of this when considering what you want to do and which route you want to take for your data system updates. I recommend starting with a cost and benefit analysis to weigh your options. Essentially, as mentioned, it starts to get a little bit more complicated when you have to do the aggregation piece. You need to consider multiple accounts, multiple meters, tenants, consent forms come into play potentially. So you're thinking of things like administrative burden and initial investments right out of the gates when you're trying to determine the path you're going to take. If you want to go the spreadsheet route, if you want to do certain things online, if you would like to create a full customer interface that's a one-stop shop, full service for your customers, or if you want people to reach out to you on a case-by-case and go about it that way. So a lot of pivot points right at the beginning for where you could go. So it's great to start with just a basic cost-benefit analysis to weigh the options at hand. Your main goal here is to discuss ways in which you can reduce the administrative burden, as well as reduce the initial investment. So when it comes to reducing the administrative burden, some key factors here, I would say best practice-wise and recommendations would be to right away assign a dedicated lead to this project. Essentially, you want someone who's familiar with benchmarking and is able to spearhead the internal efforts by ideally creating an internal working group that pulls someone from each department. There's going to be need for someone with experience in each department, as well as participation from those individuals in order to make this run smoothly and to get to where you need to be with the least effort as well as the least cost. This person also should be in charge of handling email and potentially phone support if you decide to offer that to your customers, just to make things smooth for them, to cut down on the frustration. This is going to be new for a lot of these building owners as well. So easy access to someone they can talk to and get their basic questions answered is always going to cut down on the extra time it takes or the extra frustration from someone else. Additionally, internal policies and widespread process understanding is going to be very important and helpful across your company. So creating an internal policy for what the process is if someone's requesting a year's worth of data for a single building, 1 meter, 1 tenant, 1 account, whatever fits the bill, versus the process for when someone requests an aggregated annual usage spreadsheet and or auto upload request, what the process is there for identifying those additional meters or accounts or tenants, for aggregating that data and then getting that into the hands of the customer. So clearly outlining those processes and the flows for which that'll work within your company and making sure that process is understood on a company basis will also help you. In particular, the customer service team, just in case anyone does end up finding that line, the right information is conveyed. In addition to internal policies, ensuring that if you do go the spreadsheet route, you are using the appropriate spreadsheet, i.e. the portfolio manager designated one, in order to make that process smooth for building owners, would allow them to then directly upload that spreadsheet into their portfolio manager account, and all their data is populated for them with that action. On top of this, a dedicated web page is also a good point of contact and reference for your customers. Makes everything very clear. It cuts down on the amount of outreach your customers have or would need to partake by reaching out to your company directly. If all the information is laid out, the option to submit their online request form and or instructions there for what process to take. Clear, concise, everything in one place, resource for your customers to view. In addition to that web page, another great resource you can provide that doesn't take a lot of time to throw together, but saves a bunch of time down the line, cuts out a bunch of communication that may come through email or phone, would be a user guide. So just breaking down that process for the customer in terms of if you go the spreadsheet route, when we give you the spreadsheet, your process is to upload into Portfolio Manager. Here are the steps for doing that. So a step-by-step guide based off of what your process is that the customer can then be aware of and easily access, so they don't need to reach out to you to tell them verbally or over and over again through an email. Cuts down on that time commitment as well. On top of cutting administrative burden, reducing the initial investment can also be mediated by certain factors. Essentially, we chatted last workshop, and I think a couple ago, on best practices for getting started. And essentially a part of that was assessing everything, your systems, your database, and making a plan. So go through what you have already. What are you missing? What are your current capabilities? Where are you trying to go with this? And see what you can do, where you can pivot, what route has the least resistance. So that would be the best place to start and just kind of assess all the options available to you, probably considering the full range, just to see what makes the most sense. Even if potentially something might take a little bit more investment initially, maybe that in turn increases some investments for you down the line and or improve some processes that's further down the process, might save you some more time and or administrative costs, even if the initial cost is a bit higher. So considering all your options, basically assessing what you've got going on, making a decision that way would be a good place to start for reducing the initial investment. Internal working group is very important. As with the administrative burden, reducing the initial investment can largely hinge on your internal working group as well. If you have all the information you need initially, and you know where other departments stand, what other departments could come into play and assist, this helps a lot in terms of deciding which route to go, as well as which route might be easier to take, given the resources you have internally across all departments. And finally, expect to pivot. This is going to be an ongoing process, and while we've had the deadline pushed to June 1st from January 1st in terms of meeting these requirements on a qualified utility side, it's something that develops down the line. Utilities that have done this in the past do update their system or have updated their system just based on their findings and what they've learned, by doing the process. So expect that you might change your processes, and that's fine. A good practice is to document how things are going, especially this first year, to see if maybe there's a different route you want to take. Maybe you chose the path of least resistance, but actually you want to pivot. This other route maybe costs a bit more initially, but potentially would be easier in practice. So definitely good to keep things open for possibilities, new updates, new changes, new processes. And then it's simple as just updating your user guide and or your messaging to customers. So with that said, let's dig into the nitty-gritty here on some estimated ranges of costs. And again, this is going to vary for every single one of you. It's based off of where your starting point is, where you could go, what route you're planning on taking, what internal resources you have, if you're going to develop new systems internally, if you're going to outsource everything. So quick range for you just to get a good idea of what's going on. Also, on top of that, going back to what I mentioned earlier about how there's really two scales, getting information to an owner or a single building versus getting information to an owner that has multiple tenants or multiple spaces, multiple buildings that they're trying to aggregate. So definitely two different ranges there. And the biggest haul is on the aggregation side. So if you don't have too many you need to aggregate, it's really not too much extra work. And even with the aggregation, it's not too heavy, especially once you get your process outlined and nailed down. So internal development, either option, I guess I want to say first, will require some IT team input as well as support. There are a lot of things with this process integration pieces, data storage, a lot of pieces here that would require an IT component. So either side, you're going to have IT involvement. Internal development will, of course, require IT, but also a handful of other departments. And developing it, as well as running the program once in place, can require one full FTE, depending on your capabilities or how many requests you're going to need. It could drop to even like a quarter FTE. Someone could have this as a part-time or an additional component to their current position. If you were to outsource, which you could do for any of these options, spreadsheet, auto upload, or customer interface, likewise with internal development, depending on your capabilities. If you're going to outsource, we see the typical range for some of our smaller muni groups to some of our larger utilities, ranging from around $100,000 to $250,000 for the initial investment. If you're going to keep the outsourced support and want constant updates, working with that organization, we tend to see ongoing costs for this route to be around $50,000 to $70,000 a year. So those are the numbers. We're going to let those simmer while we move into some options for funding. But essentially, the costs don't get terribly high. Even with this initial funding of outsourcing it entirely, the costs don't get terribly high on managing it, especially if you implement certain things like a user guide and or a very convenient one-stop web page for customers to access. There's not too much ongoing need for manual work depending on your situation. So I'm hopping backwards. Here we go. Funding options. So we have some options here to cover the initial and ongoing costs. So certain things to consider when you're going through and assessing what you have, determining the direction you want to go in. To cover some initial costs, you could use discretionary funds in your standard operating budget. So we could pull out some of those discretionary funds to apply to this project. You could use IT project budget. If you're going to build this internally, potentially the IT team would be spearheading that. Might be able to move some things around there. Could use the marketing or customer service budget if you do, as the follow-up option, want to use efficiency program expenditures. Could use the marketing and customer service budget because essentially if you are going to go an energy efficiency route with this to recoup some of those costs and or get a rate case going, you could divert some of those marketing and customer service budgets depending on what you think the outreach of customers would be for upgrades. There are energy efficiency requirements built into the bill currently. So these owners who are subject to comply annually are looking to improve their efficiency. So there is something here on the energy efficiency program side to consider if it's an option for you. And finally, system development costs can include the rate case recovered in the base rate. So if you are going to go the energy efficiency route, essentially you'd want to make sure you have the systems in place to pursue that rate case. You'd need to be tracking efficiency. So essentially this is an option for everyone, but potentially a better option for anyone going the web services route, because you will have direct access to the building's energy usage. So you can determine quickly and be able to track improvements and reductions over time. In addition to some options internally, there are some external resources that we can lean on. Statewide offerings include potential for an RFP, as well as an RFQ, either or, to handle some of the question marks around these outside providers. So essentially, if anybody's interested in potentially pursuing an outside provider route, please reach out to Kim Burke at the Colorado Energy Office. Have attached her email here, and she can get you onto a task force here for this, where essentially we could either, get a bid for a provider to offer this system to a group of utilities and or get a list going of a whole group of providers based on quotes, pros, cons, things along those lines. So please reach out to Kim if you are interested. Additionally, the EPA is here, especially on the web services side. If you're planning on going that route, don't hesitate to reach out to them. They're very wealthy in knowledge on the web services least resistant pathway and have all the best tips, tricks there for getting that set up in the quickest way and probably the most affordable way too, I would imagine. So feel free, don't hesitate to reach out to the EPA if web services are in your purview. Even if you just are questioning whether it's the best route, they can probably help fill in the gaps there on a case-by-case basis. And finally, our upcoming workshop. Final workshop. It's going to be sad to let you guys go, but June 16th coming up here, we have essentially based on feedback from our survey a couple months back, we'll be doing a workshop summary that'll go over best practices for the whole series. And this will turn into a semi-open format structure where flexible Q&A, we can chat about anything lingering, any questions we might have. So with that said, I'd love to open it up to Q&A. And I do see here we have a question about any updates on the covered buildings list. So yes, I can head back to that slide. We do have some covered buildings list updates. There will be the second draft updated on the website once these resources are released. And the updates include some missing addresses from the first list that we weren't given on our initial outreach, as well as we removed around 70 buildings that we deemed not easily converted into another use type that are currently right now considered agricultural, manufacturing, and/or industrial based. Hope that helps. And feel free to throw your questions in the chat and/or unmute and ask them here. Either way works.
Jess, hi, this is Kirk.
Hey, Kirk.
How you doing? I did have a question around qualifying versus non-qualifying utilities.
Mm-hmm.
How does the bill treat contract gas providers or other contract providers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they're considered a qualifying utility if they have the proper number of customer accounts. Let me pull up that slide where I have more of that information. But essentially a natural gas supplier with 5 or more active commercial or industrial connection accounts in the state of Colorado would be considered a qualifying utility. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Yeah, thanks.
Perfect. Yep. Any other questions here regarding today's comments or anything on the bill? Anything else on the covered buildings list?
Jess, hey, Tyler from Excel here.
Hey, Tyler.
Quick question. So in regards to how the bill is going to interact with any city ordinances,
Mm-hmm.
is there any discussion around like which is going to supersede which, if they do crossover, or like who has governance where, etc.?
Yeah, and in reference, just so I'm clear, are you referring to, who receives the report or how that's going to work? What aspect of the overlap?
Well, yeah, that's a good question too. I mean, if a building is kind of covered underneath both Denver ordinance and the state of Colorado, do they have to provide to both places? But also on the utility side for, operating and understanding, the parameters of each ordinance. If there is crossover, do we just automatically revert to what the Colorado state ordinance would be, or do we have to follow what the individual city would be for those requesters in like the city of Denver, for example?
Sure. So 2 sides of this. One side would be because it's whole building annual data, it should be the same on a customer basis. So if you're providing already for Denver, essentially that building owner, if subject under the state bill, should be able to work off of the same information. Wouldn't need to do additional auto upload services and or spreadsheet deliveries for that customer. That being said, I can't rule out the possibility that there may be a different organization of buildings potentially that would require for the same owner maybe a separate upload or separate spreadsheet, just given there's additional buildings subject under the state that aren't subject in their current local policy. Yeah, I'm not sure that's too helpful.
I think like as it's written now, the way that we interpret it is that the state bill would preempt our local jurisdiction.
Okay.
So
in data delivery?
Well, just with the reporting capabilities in terms of, it's not clear though how those owners will report. I think that's Tyler's question.
Okay.
Will they be reporting to the same data request link or will they be separate?
Sure. And I think those are still details that are trying to be nailed down. There's two routes. It could be through the same data request link, and or there could be a separate data request link in which the owner would need to basically just click send twice on two separate links. So I think those details are, unless Kim, you know any more than I do, I think those details are still trying to be nailed down.
Yeah, this is Kim. We are still trying to nail that down, but know that we will be working closely with Denver, Boulder, and Fort Collins on ensuring that building owners don't have to report twice, essentially, that we'll be sharing data so that we can be sure that building owners comply with both the local jurisdiction and any kind of state requirements.
Great. Thank you, Kim.
And there was another question in the chat about penalties to not meeting the date goal. I assume that's regarding the utility deadline. And I just wanted to point out that there are no penalties for utilities specified in the bill.
Also good to note. Thank you, Kim.
Kim, sorry, hopefully I can put you on the spot here and you'll feel okay with that. But I'm curious, we're running into this locally, but for building owners that are unable to get consent for under the aggregation threshold, how has the bill kind of considered that like exemptions for building owners, or is there additional, does the utility need to think through that piece more?
Yeah, good question, Kirk. That's one question that I guess we haven't dealt with yet of the many that we have. Keep bringing them up.
Add it to the list.
Add it to the list. I think we'll just have to look at these on a little bit of a one-off basis and figure out, yeah, if obviously a building owner is not able to get consent from all the tenants, then I assume we might need to get a waiver for that particular year. And, not quite sure how we'll handle each of those cases at this point.
That sounds good. I don't know how to handle it either. I thought maybe you'd have the answer.
We'll figure it out together.
I do know the bill does specify some information on ownership change, where it is stated that the old owner should transfer any consent information, data, portfolio manager account, property transfers, things like that is stated in the bill. So while this would exist outside of that situation, at least there's something covered in that instance where potentially it might be less tricky for new owners to get that consent. I'd say that is a sticky point, but obviously the consent issue stands regardless of ownership change, but I do know that piece is in the bill.
Jessica and Kim, Joel from United Power. One of our key accounts reps had a question about applicability of the building list. For example, when it comes to like strip malls and that type of thing, which typically have an anchor store with neighboring shops next to it. Does the bill apply to just the main store? Say it's the King Soopers and the address is 1500 and there's a 1502 and 1504 next to it and so forth. Does that just apply to the main address on the list or to everything kind of on the strip mall?
Yeah, great question. So it applies on ownership. So if the same owner was the owner for the whole property, the whole building, then it would include all of those additional spaces next to King Soopers in the strip mall. So it would be the whole building. Whereas if the building was split owners, the King Soopers was owned individually and maybe each store had its own owner, then it would just come down to square footage there. And essentially, probably the King Soopers would be the only one to comply with that case.
I see. So even if it is a different physical address.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the other piece. That's a great question. And I don't know, maybe we haven't nailed that down specifically, but essentially another bit to the aggregation piece could be an entirely separate address and or quote unquote building. Strip mall is a little different where tends to be one building, but technically if there was a space in between and it was the same owner, maybe they're metered separately, maybe they're metered the same, but the owner in either case decides to report both together, then you'd have to be able to aggregate both addresses. So that could be a situation you run into as well. Thanks for the question, Joel. Any final questions before we end today's session? Open to anything, whatever you got on your mind.
I'm curious if there will be any like DOLA grants or any like state grants for these types of infrastructure updates for utilities.
I can speak up to that, Kirk. We're of course waiting to see if and when we get some federal stimulus funding to the state. And I don't know necessarily that the DOLA grants would be applicable unless you are a municipal utility. But I did put it in my strategic plan that we would be able to potentially provide some grants should there be stimulus funding for utilities, but I can't promise anything, of course. It's all we're not quite sure if or when we'll get funding, but I would hope to be able to support utilities going forward. But at the very least, as Jessica mentioned earlier, the state wants to support utilities, and at least if it's helpful to do a joint RFQ or even eventually an RFP process, if that would open up the just get some more information on potential solution providers to provide this auto upload service.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks for the question, Kirk. Okay. Well, if that's everything on everyone's mind, I'll give you a bit of time back in your day. Let us know if you need anything else. We're here to answer any questions. And otherwise, keep an eye out for resources. We'll have a notice go out when those get posted on the website. And we'll see you all in June 16th for our final session. We'll keep that one flexible, so bring any of your lingering questions. If you started considering the process at this point, happy to work through anything you're running into or answer any of those snags you might have run into in the process so far. So thanks so much for joining us today. It's great having you all again and look forward to next month.